Hello everyone and welcome once again to Caleb Likes Books. Today I am doing a kind of mix of a ranking and a discussion video, which is going to be some media tie-in books, specifically some franchises that I would like to see media tie-in books for. Now this is a topic that I think is kind of interesting because media tie-in fiction is kind of a big thing that I think sometimes gets kind of overlooked. The only really media tie-in books that really get much attention, I think, are those for Star Wars and for Star Trek, because those both have a lot of books for them, and generally whenever I hear media tie-in fiction referenced, it's usually those, and occasionally, like, if I'm seeing discussion around a particular franchise that may have tie-in books, then I might see some more for that. But in general, you don't really hear as much, I think, about media tie-in fiction as for some other genres. And I think that there are a lot of intellectual properties that could have some more tie-in books, whether because of the potential that they would have for new stories, or because I just want to see more out of those worlds and nothing else really seems to be happening with them, or things like that. Just some stuff that I think would be really cool to get. So before I start, I have a few caveats, and before I talk about those, I also just want to say for this list, I have 4 video game franchises and 1 film franchise. And I think the main reason why I don't have more films is because either the films that I would want tie-in fiction for already have it, like Star Wars, for example. Plus, I just don't watch a lot of movies most of the time. I'm not much of a movie guy nowadays. I still enjoy movies, I just don't watch them a lot. But I do play a lot of video games, so I guess that's probably the reason why I have included more video games than films. But my caveats for this, first of all, some of these do have other tie-in stuff, like comics or graphic novels, for example. I know at least one of these examples actually does have a handful of tie-in comics and things like that, but I am not including that. I am simply focusing on prose novels. And then my 2 caveats for the list itself is I could not include anything that has had a new entry within the last 10 years. Or if it was within the last 10 years, it has to have had only less than 2 or 3 books put out, because there is one on here that has had one recently, but obviously has not had any more because it just had its first one. And I would just like to see more. So those are my 2 caveats for this list. So the first one I'm going to talk about is actually for a franchise that I personally have not actually had actual experience with, and that is the Dark Souls video games, the video game trilogy by From Software, who will actually have another game later in this list. So Dark Souls is a series that I actually have not played. I have played a couple of other similar games, but I have not played Dark Souls specifically. But the reason why I include it, first of all, is because they have had one novel that came out, I believe, last year. I think it was the first Dark Souls tie-in novel, I think written by Michael Stackpole, which is cool. And so that, I would assume, is going to lead to more. And that's part of the reason why this is my number 5 and not higher on the list, because I would love to get some Dark Souls books, because I find the lore and the history behind that series really fascinating. Like I said, I haven't actually played them, but I have seen dozens of lore videos on YouTube because I just find that world super interesting. And I think there's a lot of potential there for stories because so much has happened in that world by the time that the games take place. So I think there's a lot they could do with that. Granted, a lot of that history and lore and everything is already present in the game, so it might be a little bit, it may not be necessary because technically it's all already there, or at least broadly. Like, obviously, there probably isn't like very specific events and things like that. You don't get specific characters doing their thing, but broadly, the kind of general history of things. and all that. But I think it would be really interesting to get some more books for that. And since they released one recently, I assume we are getting more, which is great. My next one, my number 4, that I would like to see a little bit more than Dark Souls. And I think the main reason why I put Dark Souls last is because I haven't actually played the games and it has gotten one recently. So there's a good chance there's going to be more down the line. My next one is the film franchise that I mentioned. That has had a number of books released before, but the most recent one came out, I think, 14 years ago. So it has not had any recently, and that is Indiana Jones. I honestly, I don't know if they're going to be releasing new books now that the 5th movie is going to be coming out soon, but I am shocked that no more tie-in books for Indiana Jones have been announced because of the new movie, at least that I'm aware of. Maybe they have and I just don't know about it, but I am very surprised that there have not been more books that I have heard of, at least, announced, or none have come out to build hype for the movie. But I would love to see more Indiana Jones books, not even necessarily like a series of books, just a bunch of one-off adventures and things like that, which I assume is what the other books that have been released are like. And most of those books, I think, came out like in the 90s, maybe the early 2000s or something like that. The most recent one was 2009, and I actually have it. I'll be reading it soon. But I would love to get more Indiana Jones books because I think he's a really cool character, and you could do some interesting stuff with books about Indiana Jones. Just a bunch of one-off, fun little adventures. They don't have to be big, huge, epic books like, 800, 1,000 pages, anything like that. It could just be like short, like 300, 400-page books that are just a fun adventure with Indiana Jones. I think those would be a lot of fun. I think they would make for good palate cleansers if you're into Indiana Jones. If you're reading a big series or something, just kind of read 1 or 2 of those in between just to have something quick and fun and exciting to read. And I think that would work really well. And it's, again, a franchise that I would really like to see more books for. My number 3 is one that has, as far as I am aware, absolutely no tie-in material whatsoever. As far as I'm aware, it is only a handful of video games, but I would love to see some tie-in material for it, and that is for the Mount and Blade video games. Mount and Blade is, in my opinion, it's a little more popular now, but in my opinion is a criminally underrated video game franchise. It's kind of a medieval simulator, basically. It's a role-playing game, partial role-playing game, partial strategy game, very player-driven. There's no actual story to it, at least in Mount and Blade Warband, which is the one that I've played. There's the second game that's also out that I have not played, but it's basically entirely, driven by the player. They create their own story. There's no set story, things like that. It's super cool. You should check it out if you have not before. But I would really like to see some tie-in books for it because it's, there's just several different kingdoms that are a part of it, and it's very historically based, but it's taking place in a world where all these different cultures are like all together. And I think that it would make for some interesting books. It could go for a very kind of historical fiction sort of angle to it rather than like fantasy, because there is no magic or anything of that sort. It's all very historical, medieval, setting. So you could definitely get, I think, an interesting historical fiction type of thing out of that. I don't know how much actual medieval historical fiction there is out there. It's not a genre that I've looked into much, but I think that Mount and Blade would be kind of interesting because it's that, and it's also based on a video game and all that stuff. And it's just, I find that world pretty interesting. So I think that would be really cool to see as well. My number 2 pick is, again, another video game series that has had 2 novels released to my knowledge. But again, those have not been released anytime recently. I believe they came out in 2009 and 2011. So it's been quite a while. And I, once again, kind of like Indiana Jones, am shocked that this does not have more books, and even more so for this one because this only has 2, whereas Indiana Jones has several. They're just really old. I am completely shocked that this franchise does not have more books, and that is the Elder Scrolls series. This is a fantasy role-playing video game series, and it is, I haven't played plenty of other games for sure, but as far as I'm aware, it has one of the most large scale and deepest sets of lore and history in any video game series that I am aware of, at least. And so I am just very surprised that there are not more books set in that world because, you know, fantasy books are a big thing. It's a big genre that a lot of people really like. Fantasy fans are very dedicated and very into that genre. And Elder Scrolls is one of the biggest video game franchises out there. So kind of mixing those two things, I think, would be really interesting and exciting. And there's just so much lore and history to that series. And again, kind of similar to Dark Souls, like I mentioned, a lot of that lore and history has already been covered. There are actually books within the video games that you can read. They're not long books or anything like that, but you can actually read books within the world that go into different stories and things. And those, I think, have also had physical releases in like collections. But I think that actual novels covering those events or different events set in the same world or whatever would be super duper cool. Because again, fantasy is a huge thing. Elder Scrolls is a really big franchise. I just think that it's a very good match. And like I said, I'm shocked that there are not more media tie-in books for this series. But my number one pick is one that is for a game that I'm actually currently playing, and one that has received some comics before. I don't know if any of the others I mentioned have gotten comics, but this has gotten comics, but has not gotten any novels, and that is the other From Software game that I mentioned earlier, which is Bloodborne. Now, this one, for me, I think that purely on a what one I think would work the best, and the one that I think out of these may be the most likely, would probably be Elder Scrolls. But the one that I personally would love to see is for Bloodborne. This is a game that I've been playing recently. I have not finished it, anywhere near finished it, but I am enjoying it a lot. But I am a big fan of the lore and the history of that game. Again, kind of similar to Dark Souls. Even before I played the game, I just ate up all the lore videos that I could find on YouTube and the analyses of the game and things like that. I just find fascinating. And this one, I think, out of all of them, perhaps except for Mount and Blade, I think would be the actually hardest one to do. Because Bloodborne, if you haven't played it, the lore of it is fairly vague compared especially to Dark Souls, but in general, it's fairly vague. You do get bits and pieces of things that have happened to the point where you can put together a general timeline of what has happened in that world. But it is vague, and there is an appeal to that. For a lot of people, Bloodborne is kind of looked at as one of the most intriguing games to kind of theorize about and look at the lore and try to figure out what happened and piece it together and everything. And I think that making books based on it would take away from that in some way, especially if they were to focus on the big events of that world, because again, Bloodborne, kind of similar to Dark Souls, is one of those games where if you look at all of the stuff within that world, by the time the game takes place, that is like the end of the timeline. Like all of the important stuff has already happened. So if books were made, they would probably focus on some of those big events, which on one hand would be really cool because those events are interesting and I would love to get those more in depth, but at the same time could take away a little bit of kind of the magic of Bloodborne, for lack of a better term, the intrigue that you get from looking at all the stuff and trying to piece it together. But it is a world that I love, I find endlessly fascinating, and the lore I think is super interesting, and the history of it, the events that have taken place and all that stuff. It is just, even though I haven't actually finished the game, I would say it is one of my favorite games from a pure story and lore perspective, because I just think it is just so interesting and so awesome and fascinating. So I would love to see books for that. I highly doubt they would happen for the reasons that I've already mentioned, but nevertheless, I would love to get some. But anyways, that is pretty much all I got for you today. So let me know down in the comments if you agree with any of my picks, if you think any of them would be really interesting to get. Or if you have any of your own ideas for some franchises or whatever that you would like to see some media tie-in books for. let me know down in the comments. And that is pretty much it for today. So thank you for watching, and I will see you guys next time.